Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Lost Paratroopers of Normandy, a story of resistance, courage, and solidarity in a French village, by Stephen G. Rabe, narrated by David Colacci. Introduction. This is a story to remember. It is not a well-known story. At 2:38 a.m. on 6 June 1944, a date to be forever known as D-Day, 9 C-47 transport planes dropped 143 paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division near the village of Grenier in Normandy, France. This was not where the paratroopers were supposed to be. They were about 35 kilometers away from their drop zone. Many landed in marshy water, the marais of the Cotentin Peninsula. A few became entangled in their parachutes and drowned. Another C-47 dropped a contingent of paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division near Grenier. They, too, were hopelessly off target. A glider plane attached to the 101st, with 2 pilots, 2 enlisted men, and equipment, slammed into the marshes. The wet, confused paratroopers made their way to Grenier. The village was visible from the marais because it was on a hill. The troopers could also see the steeple of the village's remarkable 12th-century Romanesque church. By the end of D-Day, the commanding officer had ordered that the paratroopers would defend Grenier and wait for the Allied invasion forces to reach them. The officer's decision was facilitated by the enthusiasm of the villagers. On their own initiative, villagers had taken their boats into the flooded areas to retrieve the bundles of equipment that had been dropped in distinctive blue parachutes. The paratroopers now had radios, machine guns, mortars, and ammunition. With visions of First Communion, confirmation, and wedding dresses in their heads, girls and young women gathered up the unused white silk reserve parachutes. On 7 June, men in the village assembled in the church and, with the encouragement of the mayor and priest, voted unanimously to support their unexpected guests. Villagers, including Albert Mauger, the leader of the local resistance, carried out reconnaissance missions in the surrounding areas for the paratroopers. Germain Bouchier, the owner of the local café, organized women in a round-the-clock effort to cook for the paratroopers. Women drove their horse-drawn wagons into villages occupied by German troops and surreptitiously purchased bread and food. Children brought meals to the paratroopers ensconced in their foxholes. Until 10 June, the paratroopers and the 900 people of Grenier enjoyed a semblance of peace. The U.S. men offered their chocolate and chewing gum to the children. The children taught the soldiers Norman songs. Plans were made to stay in touch in the post-war world. Hope for liberation arose when 2 infantrymen who had landed at Omaha Beach, some 25 miles from Grenier, wandered into the village on 9 June. But the troopers had destroyed a bridge to their north and twice clashed with German troops. The Americans knew on 10 June that a Waffen-SS division had entered the area. The battle for Grenier began on the morning of 11 June, when villagers and troopers of the Roman Catholic faith were attending Sunday Mass. The well-prepared U.S. forces routed the German invaders. But in the afternoon, and then in the late evening, a battalion of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division launched assaults and pounded the village with artillery fire. The church suffered heavy damage. The paratroopers began to take casualties, with more than 20 dying of battlefield wounds. By the end of Sunday, the paratroopers were shooting off their red flares of distress and preparing to withdraw from Grenier. The SS invaders had at least a 5-to-1 numerical advantage, and the U.S. mortars did not have the range to hit the German artillery. Most important, the paratroopers had run out of ammunition. One frustrated machine gunner took to hurling pieces of slate from a roof at the advancing SS men. What happened after the withdrawal order proved even more haunting. 19 U.S. uniformed men stayed behind. They included a medical doctor, medics, and the wounded. The SS men murdered them all. Their war crimes included bayoneting badly wounded men and pushing them into a pond. 9 other men suffered similarly hideous fates at the hands of the Nazis. They were forced to dig their own graves and then were shot in the back of the head. 2 officers, one of whom was the doctor, were interrogated and then executed. The Nazi rampage was not limited to uniformed personnel. The SS murdered the village priest, his religious associate, and 2 elderly housekeepers. Their crime was that they had ministered to the wounded soldiers. German troops subsequently torched the village. Of the 200 structures in the town, all but 2 were either destroyed or damaged by fire or artillery bombardment. In the midst of unspeakable horror and depravity, the people of Grania remained defiant. The SS men rounded up 44 villagers and tried to intimidate them into identifying collaborators. No one broke. Indeed, their resistance continued. Individuals hid fleeing soldiers in their homes. Approximately 90 Americans made it to the regional center of Carentan, 13 kilometers from Grania, by the evening of Tuesday, 13 June. U.S. forces had just liberated the strategically vital town. During their difficult journey through the Marais, the paratroopers received guidance and food from country folk. 2 extraordinary young women, 19 and 12 years of age, saved 21 paratroopers. They led fleeing men to the loft of the family barn, some 3 kilometers from Grania. For 3 nights, the girls and their parents concealed the men and shared their meager rations with them. Looking for Americans, German soldiers actually entered the barn, but did not investigate the loft. Discovery of the paratroopers would have inevitably led to the execution of the family. Germans typically shot male resistors and dispatched female resistors to Germany to be beheaded. On the night of Thursday, 15 June, the 21 paratroopers made it to Carentan. Their hosts arranged for a guide and a large flat boat to navigate the marshes and canals. The farm family and the people of Grania would soon themselves be refugees. The Germans ordered an evacuation of the village and the region. Villagers could not return until the middle of July, when U.S. forces liberated Grania. On 22 July 1944, a U.S. priest and a French priest celebrated Mass in Grania to commemorate the military and civilian victims. Post-war celebrations including weddings, where the heroines of Grania took their marital vows in gowns made from white parachute silk. The D-Day silk from the sky had become a tangible symbol of liberation and the enduring nature of the Franco-American alliance. The village would not, however, be fully restored until the mid-1950s. The grand church could not be saved. One arch was preserved as a memorial to the soldiers and civilians who had died defending Grania and France. What happened at Grania was historically significant. The battles of 11 and 12 June had slowed the progress of the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division. Their primary mission was to recapture Carentan, the port town which lay between Utah and Omaha beaches. German control of Carentan would prevent the U.S. invaders from joining forces. The defenders of Grania had delayed the attack on Carentan by at least a day, giving the 101st time to consolidate its hold on Carentan. They had also bloodied and wearied the SS attackers of Grania, the 1st Battalion of the 37th Regiment. That very same battalion led the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division attack on Carentan on 13 June and reached some of Carentan's outlying streets. The 101st Division held on, however, and by the end of the day, tanks of the 2nd Armored Division had forced the Germans into retreat. Carentan remained liberated. By helping to save the lives of well over 100 paratroopers, the bulk of whom were members of Headquarters Company, 3rd Battalion, 507th Regiment of the 82nd Airborne, the people of Grania contributed to Allied victory. These survivors of Grania participated in future combat in Normandy in June and July 1944, in the Battle of the Bulge in Belgium in the winter of 1944-1945, and in a combat jump over the Rhine River on 24 March 1945. The paratroopers then waged war in the Rhineland area before Germany finally surrendered on 8 May 1945. The paratroopers also freed thousands of Eastern European slave laborers toiling in German factories. In their individual ways, the defenders of Grania, many of whom were repeatedly wounded during their 11 months of combat, contributed to the defeat of Nazi Germany and the liberation of Western Europe. The memory of D-Day looms large in the popular imagination. As Olivier Vieux-Vorca, a French scholar, has noted, the invasion of Normandy unquestionably ranks among the greatest events in human history. The stakes could not have been higher. The forces of liberation embarked on a journey to defeat and eliminate the murderous, genocidal, imperialist regime that was Nazi Germany. That odious Nazi regime slaughtered Professor Vieux-Vorca's Jewish grandparents. One would spend a very long time trying to master the ever-expanding literature on the invasion and the liberation of France. Films like The Longest Day, 1962, and Saving Private Ryan, 1998, are considered cinematic classics. The quintessential American movie hero, John Wayne, played the role of an officer in the 82nd Airborne in The Longest Day. President Ronald Reagan gave a memorable speech in 1984 when he became the first U.S. president to attend in Normandy a commemoration of D-Day. The president hailed the boys of Pointe du Hoc, the American Rangers who scaled the cliffs of Omaha Beach. The Rangers, who suffered appalling losses, had, in Reagan's words, fought for humanity. What happened at Grania is part of the storied history of D-Day and its aftermath. But what happened at Grania was also distinctive. It is a case where an entire locale rose in defense of the Allied troops. To be sure, individual Normans and resistance members aided the Allies. French partisans began carrying out sabotage missions against the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, as the division made its way from the interior of France toward Grania and Carentan in the immediate days after the invasion. Other French towns and villages, such as Oradour-sur-Glane, suffered foul war crimes at the hands of SS units. Nonetheless, what prompted an entire village to act spontaneously to protect men that they and their descendants continue to refer to as the Liberators or our Paratroopers deserves analysis. Despite losing friends and relatives, their village, and for a time their way of life, the people of Grania never regretted their commitment. At a 20th anniversary service in 1964, the village priest drew an analogy between the Paras floating down toward Grania and God sending his only Son, Jesus, to earth. The people of Grania also do not fit the standard characterization of French partisans under German occupation. Those who pledged allegiance to the French resistance tended to be politically active, urban people who disproportionately identified with leftist groups like the Socialist and Communist parties. Grania was a rural village. People worked with their famed Norman cows and the butter, cheese, and milk byproducts, and on orchards that produced the fruit for distilling Normandy's sublime Calvados brandy. The French department of Manche, where Grania was situated, tended to vote for political conservatives, not political leftists. Women, both young and old, played principal roles in defending their paras and the village. This was a notable development in a country that, as late as 1944, still denied French women the right to vote. Histories of D-Day and its aftermath traditionally focus on men, not the adventures and contributions of Norman women and girls to liberation. The war crimes that the Nazi soldiers committed at Grenya against civilian and military personnel have not been thoroughly assessed. One high-ranking enlisted man in the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division was found guilty in 1947 by a U.S. military tribunal for overseeing, on 17 June 1944, the execution of U.S. soldiers in a village a few kilometers away from Grenya. U.S. military investigators interviewed the villagers of Grenya, including the mayor, in 1947, about the execution of the 19 paratroopers. The decision was made, however, not to pursue justice, as the SS men that had perpetrated war crimes had vanished into eternity. During the summer of 1944, Allied forces destroyed the over 900 men of the 1st Battalion of the 37th Regiment of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division. Finally, what also needs highlighting and remembering was the steadfastness of the doctor and the medics who stayed with the wounded paratroopers in Grenya and were murdered for their loyalty to the ideals of medicine. Grenya in historical writing. The people of Normandy and France are familiar with the story of Grenya. For a variety of reasons, the story is less well known in the United States. In 1948, France awarded the village the Croix de Guerre with Silver Star. The next year, U.S. Ambassador to France David K. E. Bruce attended a ceremony to establish a Franco-American memorial in the ruins of the church. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had previously issued commendations to villagers who had rescued paratroopers. In the ensuing years, the village held memorial services to mark notable anniversaries of the dramatic days in June 1944. But in the post-war years, the villagers had to focus on rebuilding their village and their lives. European and U.S. economic aid assisted the rebuilding of Normandy and Grenya. For nearly 4 decades, contact between villagers and the surviving paratroopers was infrequent. The Rigaud family, who had hid paratroopers in the barn, did not know the fate of the men. The family had lost the paper signed by the 21 paratroopers commending them to U.S. authorities in the hurried rush to evacuate their home in late June 1944. For their part, the paratroopers were not fully aware of the death and destruction that SS troops had inflicted on Grenya. Between the middle of June 1944 and May 1945, the paratroopers concentrated on staying alive in Normandy, the Battle of the Bulge, the jump over the Rhine River, and the concluding dangerous house-to-house fighting in the Rhineland region. Some of the paratroopers also pulled occupation duty in Berlin in the second half of 1945. When they returned to the United States, the veterans wanted to forget the economic hardships of the Great Depression and the combat traumas they had experienced. They wanted a spouse, family, work, and a middle-class life. By the mid-1950s, most veterans had achieved this in an America that was growing and prosperous. Corporal Homer H. Poss, who left high school to enlist and at the age of 19 was one of the youngest paratroopers in Grenya, served as mayor of his town of Highland, Illinois. Staff Sergeant Frederick Boyle returned to his wife Carla, set up housekeeping, and attended Palmer Chiropractic School in Davenport, Iowa. Dr. Boyle and his wife had 4 children. He also served as mayor of Keosauqua, Iowa. The veterans of Grenya did occasionally reminisce at barbecues in Stamford, Connecticut, hosted by technician 5th grade, T5, Edward T. Eddie Page. Page had hidden in the Rigaud barn with his buddy, Staff Sergeant Rene E. Rabe. Rabe related how a farm family had hid him and others in a barn and provided them with a meal of cabbage with melting butter when they were ravenously hungry. Page told his wife Betty that if he ever returned to Europe, Grenya would be his first stop. The 40th anniversary of D-Day in 1984 seemed to motivate the veterans to think about Grenier. President Reagan had given his inspiring speech. Veterans of the 82nd and 101st Divisions, then in their 60s, initiated an annual ritual by jumping once again out of C-47s over Normandy on 6 June. The experienced paratroopers had white hair or no hair, but seemed as fit and fearless as ever. American citizens saw on television visual images of the stunning but sad rows of Christian crosses and stars of David at the American cemetery in Colville-sur-Mer, which is near Omaha Beach. Division and recrimination had characterized public debate in the 1960s and 1970s over the Vietnam War. D-Day seemed worth remembering as a time of national purpose and unity. Renowned television journalist Tom Brokaw kept the positive feelings flowing with his popular book, The Greatest Generation, 1998. The veterans of Grenier began to act individually and collectively. The large extended family of Private Arnold J. Martinez of Colorado, who had died at Grenier, began an extensive writing campaign to the Department of Defense trying to determine the circumstances of his death. In 1944, Martinez's parents had initially been informed that their son was missing in action. Later in the year, they received another telegram saying that Arnold had been killed in action, but with no further explanation. Arnold's younger brother, Samuel Martinez, Jr., would subsequently receive financial backing from his employer, Coors Brewing, in his quest to honor his brother. In the 1980s, veterans who were approaching retirement now had the time and money to travel to Europe. Some paratroopers approached the idea hesitantly because they believed they had let the villagers of Grenier down when they retreated in the dark hours between 11 and 12 June. To their relief, they discovered that villagers annually commemorated their heroism and bowed in sorrow for those who had sacrificed their lives for the liberty of our people. Veterans began to bring their families to meet the people that had aided them in Grenier. Most important, 2 career military officers, Colonel Francis E. Naughton and Lieutenant Colonel Urkel R. Pip Reed, gathered information and lobbied the Department of the Army to recognize the heroism of the people of Grenier. Both men had been junior officers in 1944 and had helped lead the withdrawal from Grenier to Carentan. On 6 July 1986, in a grand ceremony, Secretary of the Army John O. Marsh, Jr., awarded 11 Distinguished Service Medals, several of them posthumously, to the people of Grenier. The medals are the highest award that the Department of Defense can award to a civilian. 5 U.S. veterans of Grenier and the brother of Private Martinez attended the ceremony. The story of Grenier thereafter entered public consciousness. Gary N. Fox's Grenier, the Franco-American Memorial, 1990, offered a useful summary. Having attended reunions of the 507th Regiment, Fox wrote from the perspective of the veterans. Fox's book was published by a small press and had limited distribution. 2 chroniclers of the 507th Regiment, Dominique Francois and Mark K. A. Morgan, tried to publicize the history of Grenier. Francois, who lives in Normandy, has a special connection to D-Day. His grandparents, who lived on the coast of the Cotentin Peninsula, were unfortunate victims of Allied bombing on 5 June 1944. The German defenders had built a large bunker near their village. The couple's 3 sons survived the bombing, and U.S. soldiers initially cared for Francois's father and 2 uncles. Francois has written La Bataille de Grenier, Les Paras Perdus, 5-2 juin 1944. The Battle of Grenier, The Lost Paratroopers, 5 through 12 June 2012, which includes testimonies by French citizens. Francois also assisted Colonel Naughton in establishing a memorial to the 507th Regiment in Amfreville, the village where the regiment, including the defenders of Grenier, were supposed to land. Martin Morgan, who has worked with the National Geographic Society, has led battlefield tours around the world. Both his history of the 507th Regiment in Normandy, Down to Earth, 2004, and his photographic history of D-Day, 2014, have sections on Grenier. Morgan's approach has been to give equal weight to the memories of the paratroopers and those of the villagers. Morgan has also served as an authority for 2 television broadcasts, D-Day, Down to Earth, The Return of the 507th, 2004, by the Public Broadcasting System, and D-Day, The Secret Massacre, 2004, by the History Channel. Francois has also aided a compelling visual presentation, Papa Said, We Should Never Forget, 2009, produced by Georgia Public Broadcasting. The 24-minute story focuses on 12-year-old Marthe Rigaud and pointedly asks young people in America if they would be as brave as Marthe was in defending liberty. Francois's wife, Gaëlle, played Madame Rigaud, and Denis Small, the longtime mayor of Grenier and a historian of the village, played the father, Gustave Rigaud. The historical recreation garnered significant recognition, including an Emmy Award. Despite these artistic and literary endeavors, the story of Grenier remains generally unknown and incomplete. As Martin Morgan lamented at the end of 2018, "Despite my best efforts, though, the story of Grenier has still not reached a broad audience, nor has it been popularized to any meaningful level." A new look at Grenier is justified because significant new evidence has become available. In the early 21st century, historical societies and universities in states such as Minnesota, Tennessee, and Wisconsin began projects to interview aging veterans. In part, these archivists and librarians were reacting to the greatest generation phenomenon. Research in the military records of the veterans of Grenier has always been difficult because a massive fire at the National Personnel Records Center in St. Louis in 1973 destroyed 80% of individual service records of those who served in the Army. But some records, such as those of Private First Class Harold J. Primo, survived, replete with burn and watermarks. Properly telling the story of Grenier also highlights developments in scholarship on U.S. foreign relations. Scholars have increasingly employed innovative approaches to international history, such as decentering the United States as a foreign policy actor and analyzing the roles of ordinary people in the making of international history. This study is grounded in documentary evidence, not just from the United States, but also from France and Germany. In the case of Grenier, non-elite actors, the paratroopers and the villagers, made choices that affected the conduct of U.S. foreign and military policy, the liberation of France, and the defeat of Germany. The women of Grenier were among those who made critical decisions and exercised power. The story of Grenier teaches us that a local event can tell us much about global history. A complete understanding of Grenier also demands analysis of the roles and memories of French citizens and German soldiers. French archivists and librarians, such as in the Norman city of Caen, collected the memories of older Normans about D-Day and the subsequent warfare in Normandy. The interviews included testimonies by villagers from Grenier. As historian Mary Louise Roberts demonstrated in D-Day Through French Eyes, 2014, the joy of liberation was always tempered by the reality that nearly 20,000 Normans lost their lives in the fighting in 1944. After a long period of silence, the French have also been asking hard questions about official and private collaboration with the German occupiers from 1940 to 1944. The long-running television series, Un Village Français.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?